Mr. Gould, Schoenberg's 12-tone technique seems to have made a considerable impact on young musicians. Do you feel that it's destined to be the most important 20th century technique?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer for many reasons. Not the least of those reasons, I think, is the fact that Schoenberg, the composer, and Schoenberg, the man who made up theories, have been rather confused in the public mind. Not only in the public mind, in the critical mind, in the professional mind, in the musician's mind in the last 50 years. I think that one of the keys to Schoenberg as a personality is that he was always a teacher. I don't mean just in the obvious sense. He did teach, of course. He did give lectures and teach pupils privately on some occasions. And in the last years of his life, he worked at the University of California. But not just in that sense. He was a teacher in his writings. He constantly wrote about music, not only music as he wrote it himself, but analysis of other people's music, Mahler and Brahms and Mozart and so forth, music that was dear to him. But the most basic sense in which Schoenberg was a teacher is that he used his works as vehicles through which to teach. And this is something that one cannot say of every composer. You certainly wouldn't say that Puccini wrote operas to teach, unless it was to teach about the folly of Americans going Oriental or something, but certainly not to teach in any abstracted sense. But Schoenberg, on the other hand, was a man who taught through his works. Now, this means that what he had to teach, what he wanted to communicate through these works was the practicability of certain ideas that he had worked out in the abstract. He wanted to prove them realistically through his compositions. And I think this is where a great many people begin to say, no, we cannot proceed beyond this point with Schoenberg. One has to have a will to compose quite beyond any ideas that you feel must be abstractedly expressed in composition. And I think this is what's happened in the 20th century. You find people who believe passionately in Schoenberg, in all aspects of Schoenberg, in Schoenberg as a composer, in Schoenberg as a theorist, and then you find people who totally and violently disagree with everything that he wrote about, and somehow, consequently, come to disagree with everything that he wrote. Now, to me, this is wrong. I think that many of Schoenberg's theories, many of the value judgments even that he made about other people's music are not accurate. Many of them were based on historical judgments that were very much part of his time, and by that I mean that he had the same limited perspective that necessarily was owned by every composer of the turn of the century. He had, for instance, very little knowledge of Renaissance music, which is practically standard fare for us today. And his whole historical perspective was relevant really only to the 250 or 300 years of tonality in music. And consequently, his whole sense of his own personal activity, to the extent that he was a revolutionary, which is true enough, he was limited to being a revolutionary against tonality, to the extent that he reformed judgments about the practice of music that were really quite old, that were pre-tonality. To this extent, he was more or less unaware. He was sort of operating subconsciously. I think that this aspect of Schoenberg, the pre-tonal relationship of his music, is being looked at now as possibly the most serious aesthetic judgment that can be applied to him. The revolutionary aspect, the idea of overturning something, of throwing out into the trash can 300 years of tonal music, this was the aspect that caused everybody so much heartache, I suppose, those who opposed him during his life. And I think that the only thing one can say there about him is that in the last years of his life, he said what to me is a very revealing statement. He said that a great deal of music remains to be written in the key of C major. That means, to me, two things. First of all, it means that he was a man of some catholicity of taste. He didn't automatically assume that because he had espoused a certain system of composing music, which came to be called, not too accurately, the 12-tone technique, that all music not composed in that system or not harmonious with it or not in some way acquiescent to it was false or wrong. Obviously, this statement does represent a rather more liberal judgment than that. That's one thing it represents. The other thing that it represents, I think, is the feeling that comes very strongly from Schoenberg's compositions and from his writing about his compositions in his last years, and that is that he begins to see that the very highly dissonant forms of 12-tone music, of serial music, which was the basis of his operation from 1925 onwards, that the very highly dissonant forms aren't necessarily a concomitant of this music, that one could apply some of the quasi-mathematical, never more than quasi-mathematical, formulas that he worked out and applied these to sound formations that were really quite consonant, that were triadic, that were, in fact, precisely the sound formations that every composer from the Renaissance onward had worked with. So that what you find in the late years of Schoenberg is this extraordinary coalescence of ideas that were extremely radical in the sense that he was saying, I do not believe the arithmetical components of music as it's been practiced in the generation or two before my own. I do not believe that these are any longer serviceable, and at the same time extremely conciliatory in that he was saying, look, there is a way to take very old sound formations, very consonant ones, totally undissonant ones, if you like, and organize them in a mathematical relationship that gives them maximum expressivity and minimum debate against each other, which was the formation of tonality. So I see Schoenberg more as a man effecting a conciliation than as a man overturning things. I think there was something of both in his deliberations as composer. But it seems to me that the fact that Schoenberg was a teacher, that he constantly used these works as argument for ideas, has caused the works to be judged solely on the basis of argument, so that people who say the argument is invalid, it is inexact, it is unscientific, or it is unaesthetic, or it is unmathematical, or unsomething, say consequently that therefore the works written with this system can not be any good. And the one thing that they forget, the weak spot in that argument, I think, is that Schoenberg does, quite above and beyond his pedagogical urge, have this, what one can only call this enormous desire to compose. I think that even had he been born at an entirely different time, let's say, had he been born in the time of Beethoven, I'm quite sure that he would have written music in the style of the Grosse Fuge. He would have certainly have sought out a quasi-mathematical style of composition. But he probably, at that time, would not have occasioned quite this argument because, historically, he wouldn't have been around at a pivotal moment in which this argument could be turned against him. To me, Schoenberg is a very great composer. The older I get, which is something that I now allow myself to say, having passed 30, the older that I get, the more I think of him as probably the greatest composer of the 20th century. And I don't mean just the most formative, just the most influential. I mean really the greatest.
Thank you. Stravinsky. When Stravinsky visited the Soviet Union recently, he was very well received and he got the red carpet treatment, as a matter of fact, and his work has assumed great importance there. It has been suggested that he is something of a pioneer, a trailblazer. Do you agree with this viewpoint?
No, I don't. I don't think that, except in certain rather limited ways, that Stravinsky is a pioneer. I think that Stravinsky is a great man, but not a pioneer. It seems to me that if you look back on Stravinsky's life, you find that he's taken an enormous journey in that life, and not just geographically, and geographically too, because he is and always has been a wanderer. I mean, he's a man who was born in Tsarist Russia and who had the training, who inherited the cultural attributes of a most marvelous generation, the generation of Rimsky-Korsakov, his teacher, and of Scriabin and whatnot. And then a man who goes to various countries in Western Europe in his middle years and finally to the United States, and then in his old age, in his very old age, takes to revisiting all the places of youth, to the Soviet Union now, and to all of the other countries of Europe and Asia and South America. And I think that this geographical wandering is allegorical, really, of his musical wandering. To me, Stravinsky is a man who has never quite come to rest. I think that's because he's never been completely at home with any culture, with any existing order. To me, Stravinsky is the kind of revolutionary that some people prefer to say Schoenberg is. I should say Schoenberg is not that kind of revolutionary, but that Stravinsky is. But at the same time, I don't think that revolutionary means trailblazer in this sense. I would equate the activity of the revolutionary, as one describes it in Stravinsky's work, as being that of a man who wants to shock for the sake of shocking, I think that there's a great deal of this nose-thumbing enfant terrible in Stravinsky, and it's an attribute of his character that doesn't much appeal to me, I must say. To give you some examples, I find Le Sacre de Printemps a very offensive work. I don't find it a good jest. I'm sure it's effectively presented on the stage. I've never seen it as a ballet, I regret to say. But I don't find it an important work from any aspect that one can judge it musically. I think it's an important work only in the sense of it's acting as a kind of therapy to the admittedly high temperature of late Romantic culture at the time in which it was written. But I don't think it's an important work of itself, within it, starting from within itself. At the same time, I think that this is a very conventional judgment indeed, but I think that Firebird, which was written a couple of years earlier and is much more truly of his inheritance of Rimsky-Korsakov and of Scriabin, that Firebird is indeed a very great work. I think it's precisely the sort of work that the world has always acclaimed it to be, possibly indeed one of Stravinsky's genuine masterpieces. To me, Sacre is simply the work of a rather ill-tempered child, ill at ease, in the society to which he's been transplanted, in that case Paris. Then one comes to the middle years of Stravinsky, and you find him writing, again, spoilsport music, essentially, music that is deliberately contrived to make sacrilege of epics in musical history that are hardly deserving of that kind of parody. You think of music like the Symphony in C, which is certainly one of the, I suppose, the high water marks of Stravinsky's period as neoclassicist. To me, Stravinsky uses the classical forms of the 18th century and he turns them inside out, not because of some restoration of a technical tradition that for which he turns to them, but simply to be shocking, simply to be irritating and annoying to a degree. I think there is a different kind of neoclassicism altogether. There is Hindemith's kind. Hindemith was a man who was admittedly insecure in precisely the years that Stravinsky felt this insecurity of a post-World War I anemic disposition in world music coming upon him, and he wanted to do something to create a certain ripple in the lake of progress. Hindemith's way was a very different way. Hindemith saw neoclassicism as a way of revitalizing certain traditions that were inherent within himself. So did Schoenberg to a degree at a certain time in his life. But Stravinsky saw it, I think, as a way of upsetting people, of deliberately seeking an easy success, a kind of sensational, blatant, nose-thumbing success. And I find this very distasteful. Then we come to the last chapter of Stravinsky, as far as we know, one can assume is the last chapter, the works that have been written in the last decade. For me, these works are the most interesting of all the things that he's done. I find some of them very beautiful. I find the movements for piano and orchestra, the ballet Egon, very beautiful indeed. Because the one thing that can never go unsaid is that Stravinsky is indeed one of the most voraciously imaginative, really, composers of this century. I think that if Stravinsky is something less than a great composer, and I believe he is something less than a great composer, I think that what he lacks is simply a certain sense of application, not to the world outside himself, because that he has in enormous abundance. He's constantly picking up tidbits here and there and imitating this and that. And that's fine. That's all very good and inquisitive and admirable. What he lacks, I think, is a certain consistency starting from within himself. And I think that's because in all his life, he's never really he's never really uncovered the total character of Igor Stravinsky. I think when you look back on that life and that journey, geographically and spiritually, Stravinsky comes across as a man who's never quite been able to synthesize his own experience and his own personality. To me, this is the tragedy of his life. To what extent this will be important or be seen to be important to historians who look back on his work in the future, I can't say. I find him, however, something less than the great composer of the age that other people proclaim him to be. They may well be right, I don't know. But I do find that musically he is as much on this same unfulfilled quest as geographically he's always been.
Well, really, I think you have answered the next question I was going to put to you, that his works have become so westernized now that Russians cannot recognize their own traditional themes. They say it doesn't even sound the same thing at all, and in fact his music has become foreign to their ears. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I'm sure that's true. Not being Russian, I can't see it from precisely that point of view. The purely Russian character in his music I would take to be in large part the rhythmic element in the music. I must say that when one just for a moment returns to the earliest years of Stravinsky, which are perhaps the most interesting years, and compares the music that he wrote, circa 1915, with music in much the same style that was being written by composers like Prokofiev, who were as Russian as he by birth and perhaps more Russian by inclination. I find Prokofiev's music of that period, I'm thinking of music like the music to the Scythians ballet, and comparing it with music like Le Sacre de Printemps, with which it shares certain characteristics. I find Prokofiev's music more genuine, not necessarily more important, because I think that Stravinsky's music has this enormous influence that one cannot hold to Prokofiev's credit. But Prokofiev's music, I think, is more genuine. It's more essentially part of the unfolding of Prokofiev's personality, as Stravinsky's is not. To what extent the later works, the post-Agon pieces, the 12-tone pieces, the serial works, to what extent these are un-Russian? Well, they are to one extent, and that is that as I understand it, in the Soviet Union, very little, if any, music is written that relates to any degree to the Schoenberg theories, and to the extent that Schoenberg has undeniably influenced Stravinsky, ironically enough, only after Schoenberg himself is no longer around to witness his triumph, but to the extent that he did influence Stravinsky, or has seen to be a great influence on Stravinsky in the last 10 years, these works perhaps are just more unfamiliar to, in idiom, to people in the Soviet Union at the present time. To what extent the future will pull all this into a different perspective and say, no, these works are quite as Russian as Firebird or Sacre, this is something I simply can't answer.
Well, then we lead on to the question that should music become international? Should composers, in fact, try to retain a style that can be easily recognizable as originating from a particular part of the world, or should it become so international that it's acceptable everywhere?
I wonder really if one can say, should music become international? I strongly suspect one has to phrase the question, has it not already become international in this way? I would think that there are certain times in musical history when national strains have played a very important part in exciting the imagination of creative people. One of the most prolific advances, in a certain sense, that music has ever made within the limitations of a culture was certainly in Russia in the 19th century. And to a very great extent, the sense of cause, the sense of national identity played, as you well know, a very important part in this advance. The whole ferment of activity that took place with composers like Mussorgsky and Tchaikovsky, this had its roots in national aspiration. But one has to also remember that a very special set of historical circumstances prevailed at that time and for music in that culture, to the extent that in the 19th century, Russia produced the first great international composers that had been native to that country. And many circumstances were propitious to make these composers terribly conscious of their identity vis-a-vis the world, vis-a-vis Western Europe, and vis-a-vis also the sense of when I say historical limitation, I don't mean this in any critical sense, but historical limitation in that Russia was to some extent deprived of the knowledge of music in the West, more or less before the time of Peter the Great. And this necessarily imposes a certain limitation, and it also creates a certain and very justifiable pride in the tremendous accomplishments of the 19th century artists in Russia, not just composers, writers also, certainly. At that time, historical circumstances were very propitious for a very strong nationalism affecting music and emboldening sentiment, I suppose, as among composers. I don't think this is so today. I think that a great many aspects of our international life, international feeling, argue against this, and not the least of these aspects is the media through which we become aware of music. In my view, electronic media, radio and television recordings, represents the future of music, as of many other things probably. But I think that it represents the future of music in that it makes an enormous audience accessible to a very few ideas. And it makes it very difficult for the specialized pockets of initiative that existed all throughout the 19th century, pockets that to some extent developed without very much concern for what was happening around them, what was happening in the world outside. It makes it very difficult for this kind of specialized interest in music to thrive. I'm not saying that it can't exist. It can indeed. There is even a sense in which a certain kind of tolerance exists because of electronic media that has not happened before. By this I mean that in the past we've tended to see the existence of a culture, let's say that of the Soviet Union, as a separate and identifiable thing which we could look in on more or less as we chose. Now this is no longer likely to happen because it's terribly accessible. The music that's written today in the Soviet Union is viewed as instantaneously as it's recorded or broadcast or televised by countries all over the world, and vice versa, of course. And it means that those particular historical judgments based on how good something is as within itself are no longer very important. So it becomes more important to decide how good it is as against that which of which it is a part. But at the same time, the tolerance that is attained through recording is something that's never happened before. I'm fascinated to discover cases of composers, there really are such composers today, who write music in very old-fashioned styles. I know of one man who lives in Norfolk, Virginia, and who is not active as a composer. He's in the import business, as a matter of fact. And he chooses not to be active as a composer in any professional sense. He has no relation with publishers or with critics or with performers or with conductors. But he sits at home, and in the evenings he writes symphonies in the style of Anton Bruckner. And the reasons for this extraordinary historical lapse are that he's absolutely convinced that sooner or later it is going to matter very little indeed, that his music is today considered terribly unfashionable, and that this music is going to be recorded, and to make sure of that, he records it himself. He manages to arrange that each symphony, as he writes it, is recorded privately for him. He makes 2 or 3 dozen recordings of this, and he sends it to people who believe passionately, or maybe less than passionately, in his music. In any case, he files it away. He's convinced that when so many generations have passed, someone is going to come back and discover his music and say, now why was this man overlooked at all of this time? And he's also convinced that this is possible only because of the recording, and he's absolutely right. Now, to the extent that this provides for a kind of tolerance, an assumption of tolerance, I should say, that we've never known before in the arts, to the extent that it suggests that the future is going to examine the things that we do today and be less snobbish in the judgments that are applied against them, be less concerned with the degree to which they represent something new, something absolutely inventive and revolutionary. To this extent, recording goes against some of the immediacy that other forms of electronic communication imply, because certainly a television program and a radio program, unless it's recorded, as this one is being, they do imply immediacy. They do imply that the listener is going to come to a decision, is going to judge, is going to react to an event that's happening now. But recordings have this marvelous opportunity of saying, no, let's hold in abeyance our judgments. Let's decide 20 years from now, or maybe let's have our grandchildren decide how good something is. To this extent, I think that the isolation that has occurred historically in a country like the Soviet Union will be seen in a very different perspective 50 or 100 years from now than it is seen today, because I think that there is no question that a certain artistic hostility exists between composers in the Soviet Union today who tend to be against the more revolutionary traditions of 20th century music, and their confreres in the West who, on the whole, if one can be statistical about this sort of thing, on the whole tend to be very much in favor of the more or less avant-garde judgments about the musical theory. I think it's unfortunate that composers argue so much. They do, of course. When put together, they're constantly arguing. But I think that at the same time, recordings are going to make possible this very tolerant view that's never happened before, and that it's quite likely that my friend in Norfolk, Virginia, who writes symphonies a la Bruckner, or a composer in Siberia at the present time who writes music in the manner of Scriabin, will be found 100 years from now to be among the great geniuses of the time. You know.
You said Soviet composers always argue when they're put together, which leads me to the question of when the Soviet composers attended the International Composers Congress in Stratford a few years ago. I think it was in 1960, as a matter of fact. They returned home very enthusiastic about it. They thought it was very useful. What is your opinion on the usefulness of such meetings?
I think they are very useful. I think they're very useful right now. But I think at the same time, we have to realize that composers' conferences are something that are quite new. They're something that certainly were never thought desirable at any time earlier than about the First World War. About 1920 is the first composers' conference that I can think of that was considered in any way important. In those days, it was the getting together for the performance rather than the talking of new music, but that was simply because recordings and radio and television didn't present too many opportunities for performance of it, so they had to get together to hear it in one place. But today, composers' conferences are all the rage, so are writers' conferences. Painters never seem to get together to talk very much. That's mostly because they don't talk very much, I suppose. But can you imagine the absurdity of putting Bach and Handel and Scarlatti and Telemann into one salon and saying, have a composers' conference, gentlemen, and decide what one should do with this new music of our time? You know, are we going to go on writing fugues and cantatas, or are we going to write concerti and symphony? You know, what's going to happen? This has never happened before, and I don't know really what's going to come out of all of this, because I'm convinced that when composers come to composers' conferences, they come there less to learn from others than to defend themselves. I think they all come with the same set of biases with which they work, because composers have to work with biases. The whole force of the creative responsibility is based on a certain sense of hostility to what somebody else is doing, in a sense. And I think that composers come together to exercise, to sort of stretch their biases a little bit, but not really to adapt themselves to the ideas of others. So whether this great spate of composers' conferences that we have now, whether this is a mark of the future, or whether music will become a talking craft, is something that I'm really far from sure about. I think that one thing becomes quite clear, though, that insofar as music becomes more and more involved with electronics, not just that electronics play a part in making an audience aware of music through its performance over that medium, but insofar as composers themselves begin to work with electronics, they begin to write music that's suitable for the microphone. Strange as it seems, this is already happening. Composers today are actually writing works and thinking in terms of orchestral sonorities that are particularly palatable in a closed room instead of a large hall, for a microphone instead of for the ears of 2,000 or 3,000 people listening to those sonorities. And this means an enormous change in the whole acoustical aspect of music. So to that extent, the composers have today something to talk about, not just among themselves, but to talk about with people who are specifically trained to give information about electronic media. And then there is the extent to which composers involve themselves in absolute electronic music and prepare tape music. Most of these composers are not sufficiently trained as engineers to do this without some outside help, and so they have to have recourse to technicians, to engineers. I would think that the real conference that needs to be arranged now is a conference that is between composers and engineers rather than composers and composers. I think it's on that field that one can learn a great deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you prefer the recording studio,
yes,
or the television studio now, to performing at a public concert. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you'd explain why you have this preference.
Yes, well, I had always hoped when I was very young that I was going to involve myself with music throughout my life. This seemed to be the one thing that I most wanted to do. The one thing that I did not want to do was to involve myself with music to such a limited extent that the piano served as my sole intermediary to music. And I had always felt that as a performing musician, as a pianist, as someone who traveled about and gave concerts, that I was necessarily imposing a set of limitations on my own personal horizon that weren't useful, that I wanted to be rid of. At the same time, I felt that I certainly did not want to stop playing the piano. This would be impossible. I couldn't stop playing the piano if I did want to, because it means far too much to me. Well, this combined with this same feeling of mine about the enormous potency of electronic forms and images, and a feeling that I wanted to be involved in playing the piano in only those roles in which what I was doing then could be to some degree made permanent. I felt an enormous sense, I still feel, because I still occasionally give concerts, but very rarely, no more often than I can help. I felt an enormous sense of frustration that what I was doing then was vanishing forever with the doing of it. I don't mean by that it was automatically so good that it should be preserved. I gave some very bad concerts. But on those occasions when one happened to give a very good concert, there was this feeling that it did vanish with the memory of those who were in the audience. And that, on the other hand, recordings offered the possibility of preserving for as long as the recorded form is considered valid the best thoughts that you were able to assemble at any given time on a particular piece of music. Because one can assemble these thoughts in recording. You don't have to be subject to the whims of the moment. One is, to a very large extent, subject to whim when you give a concert. There's always this great temptation, no matter how self-effacing you may be, and I'm not saying that I was at all self-effacing, but there is, nevertheless, this great temptation, even if you're the most modest fellow in the world, to show off in front of the audience. And there are very few people who play in the same way for a large audience as they play for a microphone. Now, many people would tell you that this is precisely what's wrong with the microphone, what's wrong with the microphone as a vehicle of communication, that people do not play the same way or act or behave in the same way in front of a microphone as they do in front of an audience, that they behave in a much less inspired way. I don't happen to believe that this is true. I think that there are undeniably certain artists of an older generation who have become so conditioned to playing before a public that in fact, if they make a recording, they assemble their family and friends into the studio to give them the same sort of exhilaration that they find on the public platform. But I do think that this reaction to audience grows less and less valid with every passing year. In my own case, it was never a reaction that I acknowledged to any extent. I always felt that the opportunities that a microphone can give you, first of all, to not have to do something at a given moment if you don't feel like it, to sit and have another cup of coffee instead of do it at that very moment, if you will, to do things twice or 64 times as need be, until you have absolutely assembled the best possible interpretation of a particular work of music. Well, this is something that you cannot do in public. You can give 64 concerts. You can give all 64 concerts on off evenings. You may have also the opportunity of giving them on evenings when you feel exactly right about a certain piece of music. But even at that, the impression will be forever lost. Well, then you come to the third question, which is to say, well, look, if you don't like giving concerts and if you do like recordings, why not give concerts and record the concerts? Because this has been done. Well, it has been done. Sviatoslav Richter has done it and has done some marvelous concerts this way. But then Sviatoslav Richter is a man who I think is genuinely made for the concert stage. There is a sense of electric communication about Richter and an audience. There's something quite special. The perfume of the event, to coin a phrase, is very much in evidence when he gives a concert. I heard him give concerts in the Soviet Union and here too in Toronto. And there's no question but what something in Richter's temperament does happen to take off in full flight when he's confronted with an audience. So to record his concerts is a very different matter than to record those of most of the rest of us who don't express this same intoxication, I think, with an audience. There's another question, that even when you record the concerts of a very great artist like Sviatoslav Richter, you don't get a recording. By that I mean that you don't get a studio product. What you get is the facsimile of an event. You get an attempt to render an evocation in sound of what a certain evening in a certain year happened to be like. You get an attempt by the engineers, by the producers, by the technicians to be very discreet so that the microphone doesn't upset the artist and keep it well away from the piano usually. And what you get really is a sort of halo, a very saintly halo put around the framing of the page which announced this concert, and for people who and made available for people who want to sit back and say that was Richter on November the 16th, 1964. You know, but you do not get a recording, because a recording, by its definition, is something that aims at a certain kind of perfectionism, I think. Perfectionism not just of the performance, because that you might well get from Richter on a certain evening. But it also aims at a perfectionism of sound. It aims at expressing a certain series of ideals about what sound is in relation to an instrument and the role that a microphone has to play. And this you simply cannot get in a public circumstance, recording a concert. So my feeling is that for myself, recording is the future. And the concert stage was the past. I will occasionally give concerts if I find one or more works that I have not at the moment an occasion to record, and that I very much want to try out on an audience or try out on myself, which is what it really is. Then I will give a concert as need be. But otherwise, I will confine myself to recording.
I know that you are very interested at the present time, and perhaps you have been so for many years, in lettering. Do you foresee this as assuming an even greater importance in your future?
I don't know. I see writing about music in some form, whether I actually read what I write myself from a podium. It doesn't concern me too much. I see writing about music as an important part of my future, because as I have said before, I feel that what I want to do in my life is to sort of experience a certain series of statements about music, some of which will be statements that perhaps will be original to me through my performance or through writing or through composing, most of which will be original to other people, and which I will simply test out and hopefully add a certain invention to. The things that one can do with music, the things that, the speculations that one can make about it, the theories behind the reasons that we involve ourselves with these strange twitchings that music produces in us at all, fascinate me, and I want to write about them and to think about them. Whether I actually deliver these thoughts from the platform is not important, but I do want to write about them.
And that really is your future, composing. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Gould, for coming in this evening.
Pleasure.
Thank you.